Welcome back to The Deep Dive, the show that takes a stack of sources, bypasses the conventional wisdom, and extracts the knowledge you need to be truly well-informed.
Hello.
Today, we're embarking on, well, it feels like one of the most intellectually disruptive deep dives we've ever attempted.
I think that's fair to say. We are going to challenge the filters, those modern lenses, rationalism, centuries of comfortable tradition that have sort of obscured the original, pretty powerful supernatural worldview of the Bible.
Right.
Our sources suggest that if we peel back those layers, we find a God not operating in isolation, but actually at the head of a cosmic administration, and a world really defined by unseen conflict.
Our mission, then, is to recover that ancient mosaic.
Yeah.
We want to see the biblical text not through the eyes of, say, Augustine or Luther, valuable as they are, but through the eyes of the ancient Israelites themselves.
Exactly.
Because, frankly, if you read the text without those modern filters, you realize you have been missing, well, maybe half the story.
And that missing half is where the entire narrative, rebellion, judgment, redemption, it all hinges on that unseen reality.
I remember the moment this whole concept just crystallized for me. It was years ago, during my graduate studies.
Okay.
And I was reading Psalm 82, verse 1, in the original Hebrew. You can read the Bible 100 times and still miss something that's right there, plain as day.
It happens. So what did it say?
The text reads, God Elohim stands in the divine assembly. He administers judgment in the midst of the gods Elohim.
Ah, okay. The word Elohim used twice in the same sentence.
Exactly. Twice, but in two very distinct grammatical roles.
Right. How so?
Well, the first Elohim, the one who stands, it's clearly singular. That's the God of Israel, the judge.
Okay, makes sense.
But the second instance, in the midst of the gods, that Elohim is grammatically plural.
Plural.
And my theological training, and probably the training of many people listening, it dictated that all other gods are just non-existent idols. Wood, stone, empty air.
The standard line, yeah. Idols are nothing.
But here, the God of Israel is presiding over an actual assembly of real beings he calls Elohim. And he's holding them accountable. He is not judging statues. He's administering divine judgment among them.
Among these other Elohim.
Yeah, that was the bolt of lightning for me. Just, why did I miss this plain reading for so long?
Well, you missed it because of those filters we mentioned, the ones we all have.
Right.
And that brings us nicely to our sort of rules of engagement for this deep dive. The problem of filters versus the goal of seeing the whole mosaic.
Yeah, I think we need to spend some time on this filter concept because everyone listening comes with one, whether they realize it or not.
They do. Every religious tradition, whether you belong to a denomination with formal creeds and confessions or maybe just an informal tradition you inherit from your community, it needs a coherent system. It has to make sense.
Sure.
And the way we achieve that theological coherence usually is by using tradition as a filter. These filters, they select for verses that fit the system.
And they push aside the ones that don't.
Exactly. They marginalize, minimize, or sometimes outright eliminate verses that challenge the established system, the difficult ones.
We create these comfortable boxes.
Yeah.
Right? And any piece of the biblical mosaic that sticks out that doesn't quite fit, we label it a problem passage.
That's the term, yeah. Problem passage.
And then we feel compelled to explain it away, often in ways that, frankly, make no sense in the original context. We twist it to fit the box.
Think about verses like Genesis 6.1 to 4, the sons of God marrying human women.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Or that really bizarre administrative meeting in 1 Kings 22, where a divine spirit volunteers to go lie to King Ahab.
Right. That's just weird.
It is weird. And if your system insists that the spiritual world is neat, tidy, maybe mostly uninvolved, then those passages become like peripheral oddities, things you just gloss over quickly.
Footnotes, maybe.
Or less. But our goal here, instead, is to see the mosaic. The Bible is this massive, interlocking theological and literary pattern, a huge picture. And we can only really appreciate the whole picture when we step back and allow all the pieces, especially the strange ones, the weird ones, to cohere naturally.
So derive the system from the pieces.
Yes. Instead of imposing a system onto them that filters out the uncomfortable bits, let the text build the theology.
That makes sense, but it sounds hard to do in practice.
It is, and that imposition of modern systems faces some major obstacles when we try to recover the ancient view.
What are the biggest walls we hit immediately? What stops people from seeing this?
Our sources identify three primary obstacles, generally speaking. First, there's this tendency to prioritize our history, Christian history, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, modern systematic theology, as the proper interpretive context.
Instead of
the actual ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean context of the biblical writers themselves, their culture, their cosmology, it was radically different from ours.
That's a huge shift, isn't it? We assume they thought like us, like 21st century academics or something.
But they didn't. They were thinking like people living 2,000-3,000 years ago in a very different world.
Okay, that's obstacle one. What's the second?
Secondly, we are, I think, fundamentally desensitized to the unseen world. Modern rationalism has seeped in everywhere.
How does it play out?
Well, we've either adopted a deep skepticism, thinking and living as if the spiritual realm is mostly inert or just symbolic.
Right, the non-charismatic side, maybe.
Or in some cases, we've swung the other way. We've elevated subjective spiritual experience over careful, contextualized scriptural study.
The charismatic side, perhaps?
Perhaps. But either way, both approaches lead to this profound detachment from the worldview of the biblical authors. For them, the unseen world wasn't abstract. It was the active reality shaping the visible world. It was just real.
So we've lost the reality of the spiritual war, in a sense.
In a big way. And thirdly, and this is maybe the most critical point for this deep dive, we assume those strange, weird passages are peripheral, unimportant oddities.
Like Genesis 6 or Psalm 82.
Exactly. But when you adopt the ancient worldview, when you try to see it through their eyes, you quickly realize the opposite is true. Our mantra here should be, if it's weird, it's important.
I like that. If it's weird, it's important.
Because passages like Psalm 82, Genesis 6, Isaiah 14, they aren't footnotes. They are interconnected theological linchpins. They actually explain the state of the world according to the biblical writers.
Okay, that sets the stage really well.
Yeah.
Let's start unpacking this unseen world. Where do we begin? Maybe at the very top, God's original company.
Yes, let's start there. Before creation, before the physical universe existed, we instinctively think maybe there was only the Trinity, alone in eternity.
That's the usual picture.
But the sources, particularly the Old Testament texts, paint a much richer picture. Before the physical creation, before humanity, God had company, an entourage, if you will, beyond the Trinity.
Company? What kind of company?
A structured assembly referred to generally as the heavenly host. And we see irrefutable confirmation of this in one of the oldest books of the Bible, Job, chapter 38.
Right, where God is challenging Job about creation, asking him, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth?
Exactly. And the text immediately answers that question, or at least tells us who was there. It says, the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy.
The sons of God, Beni Elohim.
Beni Elohim, yeah. They were present. They weren't created at that moment. They were an established, existing group of intelligent, non-human, divine beings witnessing the event. They were already there.
And you mentioned morning stars there, too. That's significant, isn't it? Not just poetic language.
It is significant because it reflects an ancient cosmological belief. The people writing and reading these texts, they understood stars not just as, balls of gas millions of miles away.
Like we do.
Right. They often viewed them as living, divine entities, powerful inhabitants of the upper realm, albeit created by Yahweh. So the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God, are explicitly identified with the stars here, confirming their divine, non-human nature.
Okay, so not just angels in the generic sense. This sounds way more structured than just a sort of nebulous cloud of angels floating around. It suggests, hierarchy.
It absolutely does. The sources really emphasize the hierarchy in the terminology. The term B'nai Elohim, sons of God, seems reserved for those with higher-level responsibilities, higher status, maybe administrative jurisdictions.
Like the senior staff, the cabinet members.
That's a good analogy. They're the high-ranking officials in the heavenly court.
And then you have the rank and file, the messengers.
Exactly. The term we usually translate as angel, the Hebrew word malach, it really just describes a task or a function, delivering messages, carrying out specific, often restricted duties.
So it's more like a job title.
It's basically a job title, yeah, not necessarily a category of being. A B'nai Elohim, one of the sons of God, might sometimes act as a malach, as a messenger, but the term angel doesn't capture their full status or potential role. It's a task description.
This whole concept, God surrounded by powerful, high-status subordinates, it sounds incredibly political,
Yeah.
like a government structure.
It is understood that way by the biblical writers, precisely because that was the primary analogy available to them in their world for large-scale administration.
Okay.
Our sources draw heavily on the common ancient Near Eastern practice of a dynastic bureaucracy. Think of the the great household structure. Pharaoh didn't govern alone. He appointed family members, trusted high officials to key administrative positions over specific territories or functions.
So the king's family and trusted allies formed this cosmic cabinet, ruling with him.
And that structure, that model, is mirrored in the heavens. The Bible refers to this heavenly structure as the divine council, sometimes using terms like Sod or Adat. This is God's heavenly household, his royal assembly, where judgment and governance are discussed and decreed.
Okay. The divine council. And the clearest, maybe the most explosive view we get of this heavenly bureaucracy in action is that passage you mentioned earlier, the one that was my turning point, Psalm 82.
Yes, we absolutely must linger on Psalm 82 because it really is the linchpin for understanding this whole structure.
So let's go back to the grammar. You said the first Elohim is singular, the second is plural.
Unambiguously. We established that the singular God of Israel stands singular verb in the midst of preposition requiring a plural object, the gods. Elohim, plural noun.
So God the Creator is standing in an assembly of created Elohim.
Correct. The singular God of Israel presides over an assembly of created divine beings who are also called Elohim.
And what's the purpose of this meeting? What's happening?
It's a judgment scene. He's leveling an accusation against them. They are being condemned for corrupt administration of the nations of the earth.
Corrupt administration. What did they do wrong?
Verse 3 and 4 spell it out. They're accused of judging unjustly, showing partiality to the wicked, and failing to protect the vulnerable, the poor, the weak, the fatherless, the oppressed. It reads like a court transcript condemning cosmic corruption. These administrators failed in their duties.
Wow. And then comes the shock, the sentence in verse 7.
Yes, the devastating conclusion. Nevertheless, God says, "You shall die like men and fall like any prince."
Die like men.
He sentences these Elohim, these powerful divine beings, these cosmic administrators, to mortality. They are stripped of their divine status, their immortality, and decreed to perish like humans.
Okay, wait. I need to push back here for a second because this interpretation, it directly contradicts the traditional filters. You know, the ones that say the Elohim here in Psalm 82 are just human judges or elders in Israel.
It does contradict them, yeah.
Because if they're just human elders, why is God sentencing them to die like men? They already die like men.
Precisely. That's the logical inconsistency. If they are already human, the sentence, "you will die like humans," is completely nonsensical. It carries no weight.
Right.
Furthermore, human elders in Israel were never appointed to rule over foreign nations, which is the clear context of their failed administration in the psalm. They're judged for how the Goyim, the nations, are being run.
Okay, that makes sense.
And they certainly are not members of the Trinity. God wouldn't condemn members of his own triune self to perish for corruption.
Yeah.
So the passage really necessitates that these are real, non-human spiritual beings of high status who abused their delegated authority, their jurisdiction over the nations.
Okay, that interpretation holds together textually, but now the really big question arises. If these Elohim are real divine beings who rule, how do we reassure the listener that we haven't just thrown monotheism out the window and reintroduced polytheism into the Bible? That's the immediate, obvious concern, right?
It is, and this is probably the most crucial takeaway from the sources regarding the divine council. We have to refine, maybe even redefine, what the word Elohim actually means in its biblical context.
Okay, yeah, so.
The sources argue very strongly that Elohim is not primarily a term about a specific, unique set of attributes like omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence, or uncreated existence. If it were an attribute term signifying only the supreme God, then no biblical writer would ever apply it to dead humans, like the spirit of Samuel when he's conjured up.
He's called Elohim there.
Yes, in 1 Samuel 28. The witch of Endor sees Samuel and says, "I see an Elohim coming up out of the earth." Nor would they apply it to foreign gods or demons or even angels sometimes.
So it's not a word like almighty, which describes a unique quality. It's more like a category term.
Correct. It's best understood, according to these sources, as a place of residence term, or maybe realm of existence. Elohim refers to any inhabitant of the spiritual world, the unseen realm.
Any inhabitant, so that's a broad category.
Very broad. This category includes Yahweh, the supreme Elohim. It includes the loyal council members. It includes the condemned, rebellious council members from Psalm 82. It includes foreign gods that the nations worshipped. It includes demons, the Shadim. It includes the deceased Samuel. And it can even include standard angels carrying out tasks.
Okay, so the attributes within that category vary wildly. Yahweh is eternal, uncreated, omnipotent. Demons are created, finite, and corrupt. But they all technically belong to the class of beings who inhabit the spiritual realm.
That's the key distinction. They are all residents of the non-physical spiritual world. Therefore, when the Bible declares things like, "Who is like you, O Yahweh, among the gods?" Elohim is used there, a related term, in Exodus 15.11.
Or Yahweh is great above all Elohim.
Right. Those are not statements denying the existence of other spiritual beings. They are powerful statements of incomparability.
Ah, okay. So God isn't saying those other guys don't exist. He's saying, I acknowledge this class of powerful spiritual beings exists, but I am utterly unique, supreme, and without peer among them.
Exactly. He is species unique, you might say. He is their creator, their sovereign, the only uncreated being in that entire class. All other Elohim are derived beings, created beings designed to serve him, and therefore they are inherently inferior and, as Psalm 82 shows, potentially perishable if they rebel.
So this is uncompromising monotheism. But it's defined not by denying the existence of other spiritual beings, but by asserting the absolute uniqueness, sovereignty, and incomparability of Yahweh over all creation, visible and invisible.
Precisely. That's the ancient Israelite conception of monotheism.
And that clarification of Elohim as a category, it also profoundly changes how we understand idolatry, doesn't it?
It really does.
The sources explain that when the Israelites were warned against worshiping foreign gods, they weren't being warned against worshiping to nothing, just wood and stone.
Absolutely not. That misses the point entirely. The biblical writers understood that the rituals performed toward idols, the sacrifices, the prayers, were intended to invoke a real spiritual presence, to try and localize it, connect with it through the material object.
So they believed something was actually there.
They believed, and the sources consistently confirm this view, that those sacrifices offered to idols were actually directed toward real, rebellious spiritual entities, often referred to as demons or shadim. These were lesser malevolent Elohim who took advantage of the corruption of the nations and deceived them.
And Paul confirms this later.
Explicitly, Paul affirms this view centuries later in 1 Corinthians 10.20. He states without ambiguity that the sacrifices pagans offer, they offer to demons and not to God. He understood that behind the idols were real, hostile spiritual forces.
So idolatry isn't just foolishness, it's spiritual treason. It's aligning yourself with enemy combatants in the cosmic war.
That's exactly what it is. It's switching allegiance from the rightful sovereign to rebellious subordinates.
Okay, this is building a really different picture of the cosmos. We now have this framework of God's first household, the heavenly host, the divine council, this structured spiritual administration.
Right.
But that structure needed someone to run the earthly realm, the physical world, which transitions us beautifully into God's plan for his second household, humanity.
This is where we pivot to Genesis 1, verse 26, the famous words. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness."
The plurals again, us and our.
Yes. And based on the context we've just built, the sources strongly suggest the us here is God addressing his existing divine council, the B'nai Elohim who were present at creation.
So he's announcing the plan to his cabinet.
He's announcing his next major kingdom initiative to his administrators, the creation of earthly counterparts, human imagers.
No, wait. I need to jump in again. Because traditional theology, especially Christian theology, often interprets the us here as the internal conversation of the Trinity. Father, Son, and Spirit discussing it amongst themselves.
That's a very common interpretation, yes.
So why do the sources we're looking at favor the council interpretation instead?
Well, several reasons. First, the concept of a sovereign consulting his court before a major undertaking is absolutely ubiquitous in ancient Near Eastern royal literature. It's just how kings operate and how their actions were described. It fits the cultural context perfectly. Second, the council interpretation flows directly and consistently from the Job 38 and Psalm 82 passages we just discussed, which establish the reality of the council. It provides a coherent narrative context within the Old Testament itself.
Right. It connects the dots.
And third, while the council is consulted or informed, let us make, the actual act of creation remains singular in the very next verse. Genesis 1.27 confirms, So God, singular, created humankind in his singular image. In the likeness of God, he singular created him. Male and female, he singular created them.
Ah, so the council hears the plan, maybe witnesses it, but only God himself performs the unique act of creation.
Precisely. He alone is the creator. The council watches. They don't participate in the making.
Okay, that clarifies the us. So if we are made in their collective image, or at least in God's image announced to them, what exactly is the image of God? The imago Dei. This is a huge theological concept.
It is huge. And this is another point where the traditional filters are often applied quite aggressively, leading to common misunderstandings.
What's a usual misunderstanding?
It's commonly interpreted as an inherent ability or set of abilities that we possess. Things like intelligence, rationality, having a soul, emotional capacity, creativity, moral awareness. Things that make us like God in our capacities.
It sounds reasonable on the surface.
It does, but defining the image based on abilities fails multiple crucial tests, according to the sources.
Okay, let's break down why an ability-based definition fails. What's the first test it fails?
First, it fails the sanctity of life test. If the image of God is defined primarily by high-level reasoning, complex cognition, or moral awareness, what does that imply about, say, the unborn, or someone with severe cognitive impairment due to injury or illness?
Their imaging would be considered lessened or maybe even absent.
Exactly, and that fundamentally undermines the basis for inherent human dignity and equality, which the Bible seems to ground in the imago Dei. We instinctively feel that all humans possess that dignity, regardless of their functional capacity.
Okay, that's a powerful critique. What's the second test it fails?
It also fails the distinctiveness test. Humans are not the only creatures on Earth with cognition, complex communication, problem-solving skills, or emotional capacity. Animals have these too, albeit perhaps to different degrees.
Right. Dolphins communicate, apes solve problems, dogs show emotion.
Precisely. So if the image is just about having those abilities, even at a higher level, it doesn't create the fundamental categorical distinction between humans and animals that the imago Dei seems intended to establish in Genesis 1. It becomes a difference of degree, not of kind.
So if it's not primarily about abilities we have, what is it?
Therefore, the sources conclude the image is not an ability we possess, but rather a status that is conferred upon us by God.
Status. Okay.
Yeah.
Expand on that. Humans are created as God's imagers. What does that mean functionally?
It means we are his authorized representatives on Earth. Think of it like this. In the ancient world, a king would place a statue or a carved stone monument, an imago of himself, in a conquered territory or a distant province.
Okay, like a royal statue.
Right. That statue wasn't the king himself, obviously. It wasn't divine. It didn't possess the king's abilities. But it carried the king's full authority and sovereignty in that region. It represented his presence, his rule. To deface the statue was to rebel against the king.
Ah, so we are God's living statues, his authorized delegates.
We are God's chosen ambassadors, his viceroys, meant to represent his rule, his character, his authority, his presence in the material realm on earth. The plurals back in Genesis 1.26, our image, might even imply that both families, the non-human heavenly family and the newly created human earthly family, share this status of imaging God, just in different coordinated realms. They represent him in heaven, we represent him on earth.
And this status directly informs the command that follows immediately, the dominion mandate in Genesis 1.2a.
Yes. Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth.
That's the job description for God's earthly representatives.
Exactly. The human task, stemming from our status as imagers, is to act as God's terrestrial administration, to multiply his representatives, to wisely steward his creation, and to extend his just and righteous rule throughout the entire planet. The earth isn't merely a place for us to enjoy. It's a kingdom to be administered on his behalf, according to his wisdom.
So let's talk about the headquarters for this dual administration, the place where heaven and earth were meant to intersect initially. Eden. The sources are pretty clear that Eden was not the entire earth at the beginning, right?
Crucially, no. That's another common misconception. Eden was a localized, highly specific geographical area. Genesis 2, verses 8 through 14, goes to great lengths to define it with precise markers. Rivers like the Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, Euphrates, regions like Havilah known for gold and precious stones.
It sounds like a real place on the map, not just a metaphor.
It's presented as a real specific location. It was God's designated earthly residence, his cosmic headquarters on earth, designed to be the nexus, the meeting place for his heavenly administration, the council, and his earthly administration, humanity.
And the ancient cultural context helps us visualize what this place was like, doesn't it? The garden on the mountain idea.
It absolutely does. In the ancient Near East, the divine abode, the home of the gods, was very often depicted as either a cosmic mountain, the point where heaven and earth touched, or a lush, luxurious garden, a place of divine abundance and life.
And Eden combines both.
It seems to. Ezekiel 28, verses 13 and 14, explicitly links Eden with both concepts later on. It calls it Eden, the garden of God, and also places the rebellious cherub there on the holy mountain of God. It was understood as the localized, perfect temple residence of the sovereign, likely elevated, connecting the realms.
And the council met there, or God met the council there.
The implication is that this cosmic mountain garden was the meeting place. Just like Yahweh later meets Israel on Mount Sinai or dwells in the temple on Mount Zion, these are conceptual echoes of Eden, the original meeting place, often associated mythologically with the heights of the north, Sephem, a common designation for the divine dwelling.
So what was the specific human job description within that sacred space, within Eden itself?
Adam was placed in the garden, Genesis 2.15 says, specifically to avad it and shemarat it. These Hebrew verbs mean something like to serve and worship within it and to guard it. He was essentially the priest-king of God's earthly sanctuary.
Serve and guard the sanctuary. But then there's the mandate to subdue the rest of the earth.
Right. Look at the distinction. The entire earth was pronounced a made of very good in Genesis 1.31. It wasn't evil or chaotic outside the garden, but it wasn't perfect like Eden was. Eden was the finished prototype, the zone of God's immediate presence and perfection.
So the mission was expansion.
The mandate given before Adam was placed in the garden was to fill the earth and subdue it, Gen 1.28. Humanity was tasked with global kingdom expansion. The goal was to take the perfection, the order, the shalom, the governance of God's localized residence Eden, and extend it outwards across the entire world until the whole planet reflected the character and rule of God.
Wow. The ultimate goal was literally to make the entire planet God's home, God's kingdom, ruled collaboratively by his heavenly and earthly imagers.
Yes. The earthly administration was intended to seamlessly link with the heavenly administration, resulting in a single, unified, harmonious kingdom of God covering both heaven and earth. That was the original plan.
But this divine partnership, this sharing of administrative authority with created beings, both heavenly and human, it came with enormous risk, didn't it? Peril.
Huge risk. We learned earlier that for God's imagers to truly represent him, to have a genuine relationship with him, they cannot be cosmic automatons. They can't be robots just executing code.
They have to have free will.
They must possess genuine freedom of choice. And this introduces the concept that some theologians call theological risk.
Risk? How so?
Only God is perfect, infinite, immutable. Since all imagers, whether they are divine b'ni Elohim or human beings, are lesser than God, created beings, they are inherently imperfect. They have limitations. And this imperfection means they carry the potential for error, for misuse of power, for rebellion.
And God knew this.
God accepted this risk. The sources suggest he knew it was inherent in creating free agents. Because genuine representation, authentic love, meaningful loyalty, these things require the possibility of making a real decision against the alternative. God isn't a cosmic puppet master pulling every string, and his imagers cannot be puppets either.
And we see this freedom, this agency, applied even in how God's own sovereign decrees are carried out. You mentioned God decrees the ends, but leaves the means open.
Yes, we see this illustrated quite clearly. The divine counsel seems to have real input on the means by which God's will is accomplished.
The example you gave was 1 Kings 22.
That's the clearest one.
Yeah.
Yahweh had decreed the end result. King Ahab of Israel must die in battle. That was the sovereign decision. But then Yahweh convenes the council and asks them essentially for suggestions on how to achieve this. Who will entice Ahab so that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead?
He asked them how to do it.
He opens the floor, so to speak. And various proposals are seemingly made until one spirit steps forward and volunteers. I will entice him. I will go out and be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets.
A lying spirit volunteers.
A member of the council volunteers a plan involving deception, and Yahweh authorizes it. You are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out and do so. God decreed the end, but he used the willing agency of a subordinate, even a deceptive one, to accomplish the means.
Okay, let's just sit with that for a moment. God uses his counsel, his administration, to carry out his plans, and sometimes that involves means we might find uncomfortable, like deception used to bring about a just end.
That's the hard implication, isn't it? It shows the council has real delegated authority and agency in implementing the overarching sovereign plan. We also see this idea of shared agency in the book of Daniel, chapter 4.
With Nebuchadnezzar.
Yes, concerning Nebuchadnezzar's judgment, his period of madness, Daniel tells him the sentence is both a decree of the Watchers, who are identified elsewhere as members of the divine council, and it is the decree of the Most High.
So both. The Watchers decreed it, and God decreed it.
It seems the Watchers, the administrators, pronounced or executed the sentence, but it was ultimately the will and authority of the sovereign, the Most High, that stood behind it. They are granted real, effective agency within God's administration.
This balancing act between God's sovereignty and the genuine freedom of his agents, both divine and human, is absolutely vital when we talk about the origin of evil, isn't it? Did God predestine the fall? Did he make it happen?
That's the million-dollar question. Because if God predestined the fall, if he meticulously ordained for Adam and Eve and the serpent to rebel, then he becomes morally responsible for all the evil, suffering, and death that resulted. And that seems incompatible with his perfectly good nature.
So how do the sources handle this?
This is why the sources point us to a really powerful, though maybe overlooked, example involving King David back in 1 Samuel chapter 23. It's the incident in the town of Keilah.
Okay, let's walk through that slowly, because it sounds like it clarifies this relationship between God knowing the future and God determining the future.
Right. So David is hiding out in the town of Keilah, which he just rescued from the Philistines. He hears a rumor that his enemy, King Saul, is planning to come down and lay siege to the town, specifically to capture him.
Okay, so he's trapped.
Potentially. So David uses the priestly ephod to inquire of Yahweh. He asks God two distinct predictive questions about the future free actions of two separate groups of people.
What are the questions?
First, he asks, "O Yahweh, God of Israel, will Saul come down as your servant has heard?" And God answers directly, "He will come down."
Okay, God foreknows Saul's intention and plan.
Yes. And David asks a second question. "Will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul?" Remember, David just saved these guys.
So will they betray him?
And God answers again unequivocally, "They will surrender you."
Wow. Okay. God answers affirmatively to both. He foresees and confirms what Saul will do and what the men of Keilah will do under the present circumstances.
Correct. The divine foreknowledge is presented as absolute and certain. He knows what these free agents will choose to do if the situation unfolds as it's currently heading.
Yeah. What happens next?
David doesn't just sit there. Based on God's answers, David and his men immediately leave Keilah. They escape.
Okay.
And because David left, the narrative tells us that when Saul heard David was gone, Saul canceled his trip. He didn't come down.
So Saul didn't come down.
And consequently, the men of Keilah never had the opportunity to betray David to Saul. The foreknown events, Saul coming down, the betrayal by Keilah's men, those events never actually happened.
Whoa. Okay, that is a massive theological implication.
It is. It strongly suggests that divine foreknowledge does not necessitate divine predestination or meticulous causation. God can accurately foresee all possibilities, all potential trajectories, all the choices that free agents would make under certain conditions, without necessarily mandating that those conditions or those choices must occur.
So God knew the fall was possible, maybe even likely, given freedom and imperfection.
He foreknew the risk, he foreknew the potential for rebellion, without ordaining it or causing it himself. This preserves God's goodness and places the responsibility for evil squarely on the misuse of the gift of free will by his imperfect imagers, both divine and human. Evil is the perversion of good by free choice.
And the first imperfect imager we see explicitly rebelling in the narrative, the one who challenged God's authority and directly acted to corrupt the human mission. That was the Nachash, the serpent in Eden.
Yes. And we absolutely must discard the simplistic Sunday school image of just a talking snake in a tree. That's not how the original audience would have primarily understood it.
Why not?
Think about the context. Eve wasn't portrayed as terrified or shocked to be talking to this creature. Why? Because she was in Eden, the garden of God, the place where heaven and earth met, the realm of God's divine counsel. Talking to a divine being, a member of God's administration, wouldn't necessarily have been strange in that specific location.
So the serpent wasn't just an animal.
The New Testament writers, looking back centuries later, certainly didn't think so. They explicitly confirm this being's supernatural identity. Paul in 2 Corinthians 11 talks about Eve being deceived by the serpent's cunning, linking it to Satan. And Revelation 12 directly calls that ancient serpent the devil, or Satan. The identification is clear in later scripture.
Okay, but how would the original Genesis audience have picked up on its divine nature? Does the Hebrew text itself give clues?
Profound clues. The original Hebrew writer uses the word nachash, the consonants NCHSH, in what seems to be a spectacular intentional triple entendre. A brilliant bit of wordplay to signal the nature of this being.
A triple meaning. Okay, what are the three layers?
First, there's the most obvious meaning, the common noun nashash, meaning serpent or snake.
Right.
But even that carries weight. In ancient Near Eastern iconography, serpents often symbolize divine figures, sometimes chaotic ones needing restraint, but also sometimes wise figures or significantly guardians of sacred spaces or divine thrones. Think of the uraeus cobra on Pharaoh's crown.
Okay, so even just serpents had divine connotations. What's the second meaning?
The second layer comes from the verbal form of the root nchsh, which is nochesh. This verb means to practice divination, to dispense divine information, omens, or secret knowledge.
A diviner.
Exactly. And that perfectly encapsulates the Noshesh's interaction with Eve. He isn't just talking, he is dispensing a divine-sounding oracle, a piece of secret knowledge that contradicts God's command. He delivers the lie, "You will not surely die. Your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." He's acting as a rogue prophet, a false diviner.
Wow. Okay, serpent, diviner.
Yeah.
What's the third meaning? This one ties to his status and pride.
Yes. Through a noun derivative from the same root, nekosheth, which means bronze, or more poetically, something brazen or shining.
Shining.
Yes, think of bronze, how it shines. This conveys luminescence, radiance, splendor qualities often associated with the divine beings in the ancient world. Think shining ones.
So putting it all together, the Nachash was understood by the writer as a shining, divining serpentine, being likely a high-status divine guardian figure from the council.
A brilliant, authoritative throne guardian, perhaps, but a rebellious one who misused his position and wisdom.
And this image of the shining, prideful rebel from God's council. This isn't isolated to Genesis, is it? It gets explicitly linked to the celestial council drama in other parts of the Old Testament, particularly Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14.
Absolutely. These passages are key for filling out the backstory hinted at in Genesis 3. Ezekiel 28 uses the earthly human pride of the Prince of Tyre as an analogy, a typological figure, for an older, more profound story of rebellion.
What does Ezekiel say about this older figure?
He calls him a model of perfection, an anointed guardian cherub who was originally placed in Eden, the garden of God, walking on the holy mountain of God. This figure was adorned with precious, shining gems, symbolizing his splendor and high divine status.
A guardian cherub in Eden, like the Nachash.
Very much like the Nashash's likely role. But Ezekiel says, his heart became proud because of his beauty. He corrupted his wisdom for the sake of his splendor. He was a high-ranking imager who sinned through hubris, wanting more than his appointed role.
Okay, that's Ezekiel 28. Then you have Isaiah 14.
Isaiah 14 uses a similar technique, comparing the arrogance of the king of Babylon to another celestial figure, Helel ben Shakar.
Helel ben Shakar, that sounds familiar.
It's often translated as Lucifer, son of the morning. Helel means shining one or day star, and Ben Shakar means son of the dawn. In the ancient world, this almost certainly referred to the planet Venus, the brilliant morning star again, understood not just as a planet, but as a powerful divine being in their cosmology.
Another shining divine being. And what was his sin?
This shining one, Isaiah says, declared in his heart, "I will ascend to heaven, I will raise my throne above the stars of God," the stars being the members of the divine council we talked about earlier. "I will sit enthroned on the mount of assembly. I will make myself like the Most High."
He wanted to usurp God's position, become the sovereign, not just the imager.
Exactly. He sought to displace Yahweh, to take over the chairmanship of the council, to be God rather than God's representative. Pure hubris and rebellion.
And the consequence described in all three texts, Genesis 3 for the Nahash, Ezekiel 28 for the cherub, and Isaiah 14 for the shining one. It's basically the same, isn't it, being cast down?
Expulsion from the council, cast out of the divine mountain garden, cast down to the Eretz, a word that can mean earth, land, or even underworld, or down to Sheol, the realm of the dead. Utter demotion.
So the Genesis 3 curse, forcing the serpent to crawl on its belly and eat dust, that's more than just literal biology.
It's a powerful metaphor for being stripped of his former glory and splendor, being utterly humiliated, reduced from a high-flying celestial being to the most low spiritual status, banished from God's immediate presence from the council chambers.
But the conflict doesn't end with his expulsion, does it? Because God immediately promises enmity, ongoing conflict between the woman's offspring and the Nashash's offspring in Genesis 3.15. the proto-evangelium.
Right. This sets the stage for the rest of the biblical narrative. It establishes the concept of spiritual lineage. The seed of the Nahash are not literal snake people. They are those, whether human or eventually even other rebellious divine beings, whose lives and actions are characterized by rebellion against God, following the pattern of the original dissident.
Like Cain, maybe.
Cain is arguably the first human example, and the Apostle John later picks up this language explicitly in 1 John 3, contrasting the children of God who practice righteousness with the children of the devil, whose deeds are evil, linking Cain directly to the evil one. This supernatural conflict, initiated by the Nahash, is now woven into the very fabric of the human experience on Earth.
And following this initial rebellion, the human story spirals downward pretty quickly into profound wickedness. Genesis 6, verse 5 famously says, "The wickedness of man was great, every inclination of his heart was only evil continually."
A terrible state of affairs.
But the sources emphasize that this peak of human moral collapse was actually preceded and maybe even accelerated by another major divine transgression recorded just before that description of human evil in Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4.
Yes, we come now to, perhaps, the single most bizarre and disputed passage in the entire Old Testament, certainly outside of passages directly about Christology. It's profoundly weird by modern standards.
You tried the scene for us.
It describes how, as humanity was multiplying, the sons of God, B'nai Elohim, again saw that the daughters of humankind were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose.
Sons of God marrying human women.
And the result, verse 4 says, was that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God went into the daughters of humankind who bore children to them. These were the mighty warriors that were from ancient times, men of renown.
Okay. Deep breath. Before we even get to the supernatural interpretation favored by the sources, we absolutely have to spend some time dismantling the traditional filters that have been applied here to avoid the obvious supernatural reading, starting with the most common one taught in many churches, the Sethite view.
Yes, the Sethite view. This interpretation claims that these sons of God are not divine beings at all, but simply human men from the supposedly godly line of Seth, Adam's son.
And the daughters of humankind.
They are supposedly ungodly women from the line of Cain. So the sin is simply believers marrying unbelievers, godly men marrying ungodly women.
Okay, that sounds much less strange. Why do the sources say this view is, as you put it, exegetically bankrupt? Why doesn't it work?
It collapses under scrutiny for several reasons. It really only exists as an attempt to solve the theological problem created by the filter that says divine beings, angels, whatever. They don't sin like that. They don't interact sexually with humans.
So what are the specific textual problems with the Sethite view?
First, the text never identifies the women as being from the line of Cain. That's a complete assumption read into the text. They're just called daughters of humankind.
Okay.
Second, nowhere in Genesis up to this point is there any prohibition given against intermarriage between the lines of Seth and Cain, or between believers and unbelievers more generally. That concept comes much later in Israelite law.
So the supposed sin isn't even forbidden yet.
Right. And even if it were frowned upon, would such relatively common social behavior, people marrying outside their immediate clan or religious group, logically necessitate a catastrophic world-ending judgment like the flood? It seems wildly disproportionate.
Yeah.
The punishment doesn't fit the alleged crime.
Good point. But the most critical flaw is the term itself, isn't it? B'nai Elohim.
Exactly. This is the central fatal flaw, the linguistics. As we've already established from Job and the Psalms, the phrase B'nai Elohim is never used to refer to human beings, godly or otherwise, anywhere else in the entire Hebrew Bible.
It always means divine beings.
It consistently and exclusively refers to divine, non-human members of the heavenly host or council. The Sethite view has to arbitrarily assume that only in this one passage, Genesis 6, the standard meaning suddenly changes to mean godly human men, contradicting its usage everywhere else. That's not sound interpretation. It's imposing a filter to force a human meaning onto a divine term because the alternative is uncomfortable.
Okay, Sethite view debunked. What about the other common alternative sometimes proposed, the divinized ruler's view, where the sons of God are plural human kings or tyrants who claim divine status and were just taking women for their harems?
That view also fails, mainly for the same reason regarding the severity of the judgment. Multiple marriages or taking concubines by human kings, even wicked, oppressive ones, while certainly sinful, is again simply not presented anywhere else in Scripture as a logical cause for a catastrophic, world-ending judgment designed to wipe out almost all life.
It doesn't rise to the level of cosmic catastrophe.
Exactly. The context demands an offense of truly cosmic, boundary-breaking, creational order-violating magnitude. And only a major divine transgression, a rebellion by members of the heavenly host crossing the boundary into the human realm in this specific way, seems to fit the gravity of the situation and the judgment that follows.
So all these attempts to avoid the supernatural reading fail. We circle back to the supernatural interpretation that these were indeed divine beings. And this interpretation not only respects the language of the Old Testament itself, but it's explicitly affirmed by the New Testament writers, isn't it?
This is where we get the clearest confirmation that this interpretation of the divine being's view wasn't some fringe idea, but was actually the consensus worldview for the biblical authors themselves and for the Jewish world they lived in. We look primarily at 2 Peter chapter 2 and the little epistle of Jude.
Okay, what do they say? Let's look at Jude first, maybe verse 6.
Jude verse 6 speaks of angels who did not keep their own proper domain or position of authority, arch, but abandoned their proper dwelling place, oikaterion.
They left their assigned place. What did they do?
Jude goes on to link them immediately with the sexual immorality of Sodom and Gomorrah, saying these angels indulged in gross immorality and went after strange flesh, sarkos, heteros flesh, different from their own angelic nature. And as a result, Jude says, God has kept them in eternal bonds under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day.
They left their realm, committed sexual sin with a different kind of flesh, and were imprisoned. That sounds exactly like Genesis 6.
It maps perfectly onto the Genesis 6 scenario. Divine beings, angels, leaving their proper domain, heaven, indulging in sexual immorality with strange flesh, human women, resulting in judgment, imprisonment.
And Peter confirms this.
2 Peter 2, verses 4 through 10 makes the same connection. Peter says, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into Tartarus."
Tartarus, that's a specific Greek term, isn't it?
It is. It's not the usual word for hell or Hades. In Greek mythology, Tartarus was the subterranean dungeon specifically for the imprisoned rebel gods, like the Titans. Peter uses this specific pagan term to describe the prison of these divine beings who sinned. He says they were committed to chains of gloomy darkness, kept for judgment, right before he mentions Noah and the flood. The linkage is undeniable.
So the New Testament writers clearly understood Genesis 6 as a story about divine beings transgressing boundaries.
Unequivocally. Furthermore, this interpretation wasn't unique to Peter and Jude. It was the overwhelming consensus interpretation in Second Temple Judaism, the period between the Old and New Testaments. This is evidenced by widely circulated and influential texts from that era, like the Book of 1 Enoch, which elaborates on the Genesis 6 story in great detail. The biblical writers inherited this view.
Okay, so this divine transgression corrupted the human realm, polluted human bloodlines perhaps, and accelerated the wickedness that ultimately necessitated the flood judgment. And the immediate consequence of this illicit union, Genesis 6 verse 4 tells us, was the offspring, the Nephilim.
Yes. These were the hybrid offspring resulting from the union of the divine sons of God and human women. The text describes them as the Nephilim, a word possibly related to falling or giants, and calls them the Gibborim, the mighty warriors that were from ancient times, men of renown.
So essentially, part divine, part human giants or demigods.
That seems to be the implication. Their presence added an element of chaos, violence, and likely genetic corruption that piqued the evil on the earth, confirming that the human sphere, the human administration of earth, had been catastrophically compromised by the rebellion of these created Elohim from the heavenly council. It was a mess that required drastic divine intervention.
Okay. That brings us toward the end of this particular deep dive, and it's been a lot. We've covered vast, often hidden, maybe even disturbing territory from the cosmic bureaucracy before creation to hybrid offspring just before the flood. So stepping back, what does this recovery of the ancient supernatural worldview mean for the biblical mosaic as a whole? How does it change the big picture?
I think it fundamentally reframes the entire narrative. It means the Bible is not merely a moral instruction manual for individuals or just a history of ancient Israel. It is presented as a grand cosmic history, a story of universal administration, rebellion, conflict, and restoration involving both heaven and earth.
And we've uncovered some core takeaways that really shift our perspective. Can we summarize those?
I think we can boil it down to maybe 4 major shifts. First, the reality of the divine council. We established that the term Elohim includes real, created spiritual beings forming a celestial administration over which Yahweh alone is the supreme, unique, uncreated, and incomparably sovereign creator.
Okay, council reality. Second.
Second, humanity's core identity is defined not by our abilities, but by our status. We are created as God's authorized imagers on earth, meant to share his rule, represent his presence, and extend Edenic perfection across the globe as the human part of his unified administration.
Imager status. Third.
Third, rebellion against God did not originate with humanity in Genesis 3. It occurred first in the heavenly realm with the Nasha Shining One, and then again with the transgression of the sons of God in Genesis 6. These divine sins created the context, the environment for subsequent human moral failure and corruption. Rebellion is cosmic, not just human.
Divine rebellion first. And fourth.
And fourth, despite these catastrophic rebellions in both realms, God's original intention, his kingdom agenda to fill the earth with loyal, flourishing imagers living in his presence, was never ultimately defeated, only seriously disrupted and delayed. He preserved a faithful human line through Noah, and he immediately promised a future human descendant, Genesis 3.15, who would definitively crush the head of the Nashash. The conflict is ongoing, but the ultimate victory for God's plan is assured from the beginning.
Wow. So this recovered worldview, it really informs every major doctrine, doesn't it? Creation, fall, redemption, judgment. It all looks different viewed through this lens. It shows that the conflict between good and evil is much bigger than us. It involves both the visible and invisible realms.
Exactly. Our sources confirm that the human story is presented as this massive providential saga of divine administration, repeated rebellion by free agents, both divine and human, judgment, and God's persistent, patient plan for ultimate reclamation and restoration. And crucially, it means our choices, our actions as God's designated imagers on earth now, they truly matter. They have cosmic significance within this ongoing plan.
The ultimate payoff, then, of doing this deep dive, trying to see the Bible through these ancient eyes, is realizing that the entire story is heading somewhere specific.
Yes, it culminates not just in individuals going to an airy, disembodied heaven somewhere up there, but in the restoration of the original plan, the creation of the new heavens and the new earth. A new Edenic earth where glorified humanity, finally freed from sin and imperfection, rules alongside Christ as restored imagers, reunited in perfect harmony with the loyal members of the heavenly host. The two households finally perfectly integrated.
The journey ends with the full perseverance and accomplishment of God's original intention, not with total defeat or just a spiritual escape plan.
That's the hope, the original vision restored and fulfilled.
So let's leave you, our listener, with this final provocative thought to mull over. If this ancient supernatural worldview is largely correct, if the entire world is still, right now, defined by this ongoing conflict between loyal and rebellious spiritual powers, those Elohim sentenced to death back in Psalm 82, but not yet fully executed, and if God created and commissioned you to be his representative, his imager on earth today, carrying his status and authority in your sphere of influence, what is one concrete step, one intentional action you should take this week to consciously live and act as a loyal imager in that cosmic conflict, knowing that the unseen world is fully engaged and that your choices contribute to manifesting God's kingdom right here, right now?